Hello and welcome. This is Carl of Nintendo Deep Dive, here with another review for you. To those uninitiated, this video is part of a larger review series concerning the N64 console and its software library. As a matter of fact, this is the last dedicated review of that series, though there will be a summary video to follow. So, let's just dive right into Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Things I could say about this game. I've made 6-hour long Zelda reviews in the past, but I don't know if that's terribly edifying to do, and we're just going to keep this one shorter. But there's so much I could say about this game. Typically in these reviews, I'm coy about my general appraisal about a game till near the very end. But there's really no point being that way with this game. It's a great game, a phenomenal game. This playthrough, there was certain things about it that I wasn't as enamored with. Some of that was some flaws I noticed, and some of it was just me being old and jaded, but it's still a phenomenal game. And the thing I find phenomenal about Majora's Mask is it has to do with the concept of a zero-sum game. And this is an idea that applies to everything, not just games. But in the case of games, it's when a developer says they're focusing on exploration, say in a Zelda game, that means the dungeons. You can just take it for granted that the dungeons are going to be less developed, or vice versa. The overworld is going to be more barren. If a developer is pushing into new territory, that means that a lot of the older ideas are going to fall by the wayside. If Sakurai says that he's putting all the old characters in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, naturally he's going to follow up with, and he did, don't expect too many new characters. That's the concept of the zero sum. To add to one thing is to take away from another. And for Majora's Mask, that just isn't really the case. There's a few games like this. And those games, like this game, they're going to get high marks from me because they have extra put into them. And it's not within the budget. They go over the budget. Majora's Mask, in particular, it's a game where they can build out the side content, or they do build out the side content, and then the critical path is also very strong. The game deviates from the typical traditions of Zelda, but also within itself actually holds to the core tenets in a way that the core Zelda fan base can really grab onto. And, in other ways where them focusing on this would take away from that, it just isn't the case. The game basically has everything going for it. Mostly, some stuff is stronger than others, but there's no aspect of the game that I can tell where something was priority over something else. And that's a very beautiful thing. And that's the really, really strong component about Majora's Mask. Now, there's some things people say to the contrary of that. They say that the side content's really great with all the masks and stuff, but there's only 4 dungeons. There's only 4 dungeons. It came at the cost of 4 dungeons. There is only 4 dungeons, but these dungeons are massive. It's such a nominal way to look at this game if you played it. You should know that these dungeons are not made equal to your average Zelda dungeon, just in length. For instance, I've played Zelda games multiple times, so it's hard to say how long a dungeon will take on the first go around. First go around for an average dungeon will be like an hour and a half for the newer ones, maybe. And I say newer, I mean the older, newer ones, not Breath of the Wild. But then going forward, maybe an hour. Maybe an hour and a half for the really hard-hitting ones like water temples and stuff like that. But Majora's Mask, outside of the first, and this is on my 5th playthrough, or I played it 6 times, beaten it 5 times, this being the 5th. For this game, outside of the first dungeon, Woodfall Temple, they took me 2 hours and change. Like 2 hours and 10 minutes, 2 hours and 8 minutes, the last 3. And Woodfall Temple took me about an hour and 12 minutes. And that's the first dungeon. And I've played these 5 times. So that's like, what, 7.5 hours of dungeon content? So it's more than Wind Waker. It's more than Minish Cap. It's maybe equivalent to Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. And it's about equivalent to Skyward Sword. It's not equivalent to Ocarina necessarily, like by a little bit, nor particularly Twilight Princess. But, it's equivalent to other Zelda games I haven't mentioned. And that's just quantitatively. Qualitatively, they're actually the strongest dungeons in the entire series. The first one, at the very least, is quite good, Woodfall. It's more than just a typical starter dungeon with a forest theme. There's more to it, and I can't really put it into words. But the others, they're like the best dungeon in any Zelda game, all 3 of them. I know some people don't like Great Bay Temple. Great Bay Temple is wonderful. You get to swim around as the Zora, so the swimming controls can't be all that bad, though it is a little cramped, but confusing. Sure, all of these dungeons are the kind of dungeons that they don't lay the path out for you. You need to find the path. I mean, they're still probably semi-linear, and there's like optional stray fairies to find too, which is a unique attribute of them, which definitely adds to the time in a meaningful way, albeit. But they're the kind of dungeons that they may make you feel stupid, but they're not unintuitive or badly designed, but they're quite navigation heavy and they're very cerebral. They have some pretty tough puzzles and some tough platforming challenges in them too. I don't know if the puzzles are like the best in the series, but it's very strong, and then taken together with the visual design and the central gimmicks and the thematic motifs. It's 4 dungeons it may have, but they contribute to probably like the strongest set of dungeons in the Zelda franchise, going head to head with probably Twilight Princess for the top spot. I know people like Skyward Sword, and we could talk about that, but the dungeons are not this compromised thing, is my point. And their themes, even there's only 4 themes, they're fantastic visually, just like the rest of the game. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Then there's the side content, of course, is very rich with not only good side quests, but there's lots of really valuable extrinsic rewards in those side quests, such as the masks that are just this tactile thing that you get, this real in-game object that's imbued with personality and even sometimes with a very iconic look to them. And beyond just the extrinsic value of that, you also get like this intrinsic value where there's these little beats that are charming and they really hit you and surprise you. So the side content is wonderful. So it's overall like it's a game that just, despite what people say, there's really nothing I could say. I couldn't agree with any of it. And now another aspect that people are quite wary of, though I don't think this is really a recurring thought in the core Zelda audience, not really anymore. This game is in generally good standing. And that's the time limit aspect itself, the 3-day cycle. And, some people I think are just terrified of a time limit. They just climb up, kind of like how I can't handle jump scares in movies. Just can't do it. And maybe it's similar to them. They just get sick in the stomach and can't handle it. Even so, though, the fact of the matter is that the time limit is not a real barrier. There's so many ways you can manipulate it, all of which those ways are explicitly told to you within the critical path too, right at the start of the game, whether that be doubling the time you have or speeding through the day, time skipping. It's all mentioned to you, and if you forget it. You can go back to that point, or you can go to other points where that NPC who tells you that will be there. So I don't really see how that's an obstacle. It's pretty laid out in front of you. And then if you double the time, you should have about 3.5 hours, I think, or maybe at least 3 hours to do a dungeon. So you should be able to get it done. I heard people make some very outlandish statements about the fact that you lose all your progress, like all the progress to get to the dungeon, but it's like, well, no. I mean, the game kind of lays out what you keep in the game when you go back in time, so you should be picking up on that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The time limit isn't really that daunting, or it shouldn't be. In fact, I actually kind of like time limits in games, and I take a comfort in them because a time limit suggests that the developer has streamlined and refined the experience to the point that tasks can be completed well within that given time frame. Them putting those time frames in there is kind of a promise that this can be done with a level of efficiency. Oddly enough, the kind of stuff that you would expect them to streamline out can be found in the 3D remake of this game. The bosses, particularly 3 and 4, those fights, they can take forever. I think I had the entirety of the 3rd day left in the 4th temple with Twin Mold, and I think they wore me down to the last, not the final hours, just before it. But that's not in this game, but it's interesting that like the very thing I'm talking about wouldn't be in a game with a time frame is in the remake of this game, which is quite a misstep. But otherwise, the game is instilling in me confidence that things can be done in an efficient manner. Pardon me. And speaking of an efficient manner, the time limit itself instills in me a desire to be efficient. And so one of the things about the 3-day cycle, and I'll actually kind of get into this maybe now. I'm a little out of order now, unfortunately, but the 3-day cycle prior to this playthrough, I would have said, oh, it's incredible. It's an incredible thing. It's so smart and it neatly implemented. And now that I played it, maybe it's like I've seen the man behind the curtain, to quote the Wizard of Oz, and so now it seems kind of mundane. But the time limit, it mechanically speaking, or not the time limit, the 3-day cycle, it seems kind of simple and pretty rudimentary in a lot of ways, less magical than it was on the outset. Like just pretty simple scripting where NPCs move around based on the day, and it's not anything truly incredible. And that being said, though, the way they tie the story into it, like the implications of you fixing things and then having those things be undone, and all you have for those things that you fixed are just these trinkets, but you've accomplished nothing. That's an implicit storytelling that they never exposit on fully, but every player can kind of feel that sense of like a lack of accomplishment, and that's very strong and compelling narratively. And even just within the characters, watching them change over the course of 3 days, especially in the final hours, that's very compelling and works well within this concept. And if you're just kind of playing it for the first time like I was, and you're not really following any of these things, but you're just sort of noticing them on the periphery, it adds a sense of dynamicism, like you're in a real world, which is really cool for a console that I would say is very static in its environments. Typically things don't typically change, so the fact that everything's moving around and you're kind of getting glimpses of it can make this feel quite magical. But if you're looking at it dead on, it can appear kind of simple. That being said, though, in terms of an efficient mindset, I enjoy that the game instills in you a sense of efficiency, or it does for me. And so when I was playing it this time around, there was things that I did that I hadn't done before. And I was almost playing it like a Pikmin game, though. I would say Pikmin's a little more pointed in this aspect. But I was taking on one quest where I gave my sword to the blacksmith on the first day to get to the gilded sword. And then after I did that, I had to do the Goron races, but then I had to blow up the hole in the wall before that, and then I did the Goron races, and either before or after that, I had gone to the Romani Ranch to be employed by Romani herself with the invaders, and so I had to beat the Goron race within a set amount of time so I could go to Romani Ranch and take care of the invaders at night. Then after I had done that, the sister, whatever her name is, she offers to take me to town, so I have to be there again at 7 p.m. on the second day. And before that, though, I go and get my sword, but then I give it back because it needs to be sharpened again to complete the final form of the sword. And so all the while, I'm doing all these things. I'm running around without a sword, and then I'm doing the ride along on the milk cart with the masked bandits, and doing all these things and fitting them all together. And then in the meantime, I have a minute to track down the ghostly singer, or the ghost dancer rather. He's not a singer, and you just fitting all this stuff in. It feels a little bit exciting, a little bit of tension, and it's a lot of fun. I like it just for that. As you kind of run out of things to do, though, you may find yourself just passing the time. And that's actually interesting that sometimes you're just doing mini games, not to win anything, but just to pass the time. And that makes them, in a sense, more valuable. But it's not all sunshine and roses, because as you run out of things, there's just not stuff you can do while you're taking on like the big final quest, or it's not necessarily the final quest, but it's towards the tail end with Anju and Cafe. Should you fail that quest, particularly, which I think I failed that quest like 3 or 4 separate times. I think I beat it twice only, or so. Yeah, should you fail that quest, then you may find yourself sitting around waiting for certain key events to trigger, or you need to trigger them, so you need to wait around to trigger them. And I'm not going to get into how that quest can unravel, but I'll have it up on the screen exactly the steps to that quest, and should you fail, things you have to wait through. And again, this is for this particular version where this would be an explicit problem. And so there is that aspect of the time limit where it can feel like just kind of an added step in a fetch quest where you're just waiting. And speaking to the Anju and Cafe quest itself, I understand it's a pretty interesting quest on paper, and maybe had I done it in a organic sense, it would be kind of special and I could be reliving that every time I did it henceforth. But because I didn't, and I'll get into that in a little bit, it's kind of just a lot of talking to people and waiting around in, the nuts and bolts of it. I do think about, like, as you play the game, maybe through a first or second playthrough, you pick up on these little threads and you piece them together. And then when you finally uncover this, extensive quest that runs over the course of 3 days, it'd be very magical and surprising, certainly. And, there's a lot of good writing and good story in it to reward you for piecing it all together. It'd be very compelling. But for me, this was my second playthrough on the 3D version, and I was just saying to myself, "Oh, I have to get the final thing, the final item you get. Oh, I can't do it. I need to get it." And so I looked it up, and so every time I play this quest, it's informed by the fact that I just looked it up on Zelda Dungeon, and not by like a real actual interaction with it. And that's a really bumming out fact. Sometimes I just go through the motions with games, and even though I already know the solutions, I enjoy the solutions because it's informed by a really nice memory tied to it. But there's no such memory, and it's just kind of the formulaic. Well, you go over here, and then you do this, and then you can do that, and blah blah blah. And the quest, like, outside of that, like, that's what the quest is, and the quest kind of does a really bad job of keeping you on it, and maybe that's intentional, but it diverges in certain places, and if you follow down the wrong path, you may not have time for the other thing, and you needed to do it in a certain order, blah 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 blah. Again, it's all going to be written up before, but yeah, that's where the time limit can be not such a what would be the word an asset, at least not to me anyway. But I just was talking about the story a little bit and how it relates to the 3-day cycle, and the story in general in this game is really, really good. It doesn't really develop in the typical adventure sense. It's not really an adventure. It's more of a existential crisis in a lot of ways. You're stuck in sort of the same rut over and over again. And as you relive it, those 3 days over and over again in this Groundhog Day setting or Groundhog Day conundrum, you meet other people and you see how they're dealing with this existential crisis of the moon crashing down on the world, and they're wondering to themselves if it really will crash. And then in the final hours, you get to see like a drastic shift of many of those characters and how they're going to handle it. And it's very interesting, even if it's not actually like, it's almost like one dimensional. It's not really even two dimensional. As far as the plot goes, the plot's pretty simple. And pretty much the entirety of the plot plays out in the prologue. But the writing within all of it is really, really good. Maybe the strongest writing in any Zelda game. It's hard to say for sure, but it's really great writing in any video game. It's not necessarily heavy or deep or profound on the surface, though this game has a following of people who really read into all of the themes, and they hypothesize many things, and they have their own special headcanon, and they go crazy thinking about all the implications of the story. And you probably heard about some of their findings. I personally really don't delve too deep into any of this, and I don't really credit too much of it either. But even if I don't, this game, there's just certain little parts of it with the writing where they just like, I don't know, they get your speculative juices flowing. You know, they evoke all this fervor about it, and combine that with a very surrealistic aesthetic. You know, it's no wonder that people go crazy trying to figure out the formula with this game. Particularly with the Happy Mask Salesman. He's really weird. The fact that he's, I don't know how they describe it, just how he kind of like, they cut out frames of his movement or something. He like lacks keyframes or something like that. I don't know if that's exactly it. If you know what I'm talking about. But even in his final moments that you see him walk away, and then he, rather than, walking over a hill, he actually like teleports. And so it makes you think of the nature of what exactly he is. You always wonder if he's really benevolent or if he's kind of neutral, and that he like teleports in a really odd way is very, I don't know. Makes him feel like some kind of odd dimensional interloper. And even like the writing, the masked children inside the moon, they give you these little quandaries that they're thinking about, like these little statements that they make, like, oh, what makes you happy? Does it make other people happy? That's the one that I can think of off the top of my head, and I'm sure I'll have the others on the screen. And they're just these weird little statements that seem kind of out of left field, and it drives you to think about the game, and it touches on this profound feeling, even if what's being said maybe isn't that profound. It's hard to say though. When I was a teenager, I watched Mad Men, and I haven't gone back to that show since. So I don't know what the themes of that necessarily were, and I didn't know the themes of it back then either. But what I did know was that there was something more being said than was just, in the immediate dialogue. And it was all going over my head and either side of me. And I didn't know what it exactly was, but I knew it was there. And so even though the sense of profundity was vague, I could still very much feel it, and it still was very edifying. In the same way I look at the story of Majora's Mask. In that sense, I am edified by things that I can't quite put my finger on, and I wouldn't really try to make a career out of making definitive statements out of baseless headcanon, but there's definitely something there. Disappointingly, a thing that bothered me is I don't think the story really hit me that hard this playthrough, but the writing, individual pieces of it certainly did. And I'm definitely happy about that. And, beyond the main story itself and the dialogue, in the side quest, there's just these little moments that happen, usually as a result of the mask that you have. So not only the mask cool because they exist as this in-game object, in-world object, and so they're a collectible. Even if they're just a collectible, they are super interesting and unique and have an innate value in that they exist as a unique thing. But the little moments that occur because of them can be so entertaining and surprising, mostly surprising. When you get the conductor's mask, or the troop leader's mask, I think it's called. It kind of looks like a chicken. You go to a certain point where there's all these little chicks, and you essentially play a little piccolo or a little piper or something. A fife. I don't know. Something like that. I don't even know where you get it. Like a little marching band tune, essentially, as you wear this mask and you activate it, and all these little chicks follow you around in single file, and then they become roosters, and then you get an item for that, a very essential item. It's another mask, and there's really only two essential masks, really, that are super important, the others being incidental. But this one mask that you're wearing, it's only tied to this moment, really, that I know of. I think you can use it in other places for incidental consequence, but it's such a cute little moment. And there's another moment that I didn't realize was in the game until this playthrough, where there's this big argument raging across all 3 days of the game. And I thought it was just a fixture of the game. But if you don a certain mask, then all of a sudden realizations occur, and then that argument settles. And hey, you get a heart piece for it, which, you know, at this point, I did not need a heart piece in the game, but just the resolution of this thing was certainly very surprising. And I don't know, I enjoy those surprising moments, and they add a great sense of reward to these side quests, in addition to just receiving these very odd and iconic masks alongside of them. And I bring up the word iconic in my review for Oracle of Ages. My main gripe with that game that I had dawn on me was that the game is not, it's not iconic. It just doesn't really have any kind of strong imagery that I can hold on to. Not really. But for Majora's Mask, from the rooms, the objects that you receive, it's so iconic, all of it. Like little pointless rooms, like the room where you get the Deku Princess. It's got these interesting decals in it, and it's got this little stump room that you never seen anywhere else, that asset. And, you know, I can vividly remember it. And there's a grave that you can dig up on the third day where you play a mini game with the Graveskeeper. And that room also very iconic, like the way the lights flood in, and just this big room with weird little fixtures in it too. And it's a memorable place, even though it's not actually terribly important. And there's another room where there's these Stalfos conducting a meeting at a table, and there's these masks, and it I don't know, they make like really interesting places in this game. Very iconic, very striking. The spider house in the swamp, it's got this kind of golden Chinese palace look to it, with red and golden highlights. I don't know how they do it. It's stuff that's like just has a strong visual design, and that goes right to the items. As I was saying, some of the masks you get, they're just super weird looking, and, you know, all the more memorable. The equipment that you use, like the sword, the gilded sword, a little garish in a lot of ways, but I really like the leaf-shaped blade that it has, and also has a lot of reach, which is very helpful. The mirror shield. Everybody would remember the mirror shield from this game, with its chrome face that's sort of in a state of discomfort. And you know, for the art style in general, like all the dungeons, of course, the visual motifs and the themes used, really great stuff. I mean, I'll touch on that in a bit, like when I touch on things more broadly. But Takaya Amura, who was the art director of Star Fox 64, I believe, and F-Zero X, also did most of the art for this game. And I'm not going to say I could tell the pedigree off the bat, but like F-Zero X and Star Fox 64, which have very bold colors, so does Majora's Mask. It's almost garish. You know, it doesn't really fit in with typical fantasy, but due to the surrealistic atmosphere of the game, fits in really well. And I just love all the texture work in this game. This was one of 2 games that required the expansion pack. And it seems like with all that extra space, whatever, 4 megabytes, they just went crazy with textures. They put these decals everywhere, and all of these decals are sort of, they're not generic, they're sort of abstract. They're never really the shape of anything like a dragon or a knight or a sword or like a horse. It's just all kind of abstract imagery, but it's all very brightly colored, and it's you look at them and you can almost see something, even if you're never quite sure what you're looking at in these vibrant decals on all the walls. And just generally speaking, like speaking to the atmosphere, yeah, it's a beautiful game. Ikana Canyon is the most interesting place in the game, with the castle and the little musical house and the well and the spring. And this kind of goes back to story, but the canyon itself is sort of windswept and accursed and just dried out. And its inhabitants are essentially mostly ghosts, locked in a struggle that they've carried with them into the afterlife. Really interesting. And the stone tower itself is essentially a homage to the Tower of Babel in many ways, which is pretty cool. And there's like certain developments within that even, and even it ties into the central mechanical motif or conceit of the dungeon. All the other areas also very strong, and as I was saying, in just individual rooms are just iconic, even when they have no right to be in a lot of ways. That being said, I do have some qualms with the game, and I was aware of like one or two of these in past playthroughs, but there's a few other things I picked up on that I was explicitly looking for in this playthrough. And the game, the mistakes that it makes are pretty deliberate, and they're all of the same ilk, and it's all amounts to padding. Though, interestingly enough, it's not like egregious padding. It's just like little bits here and there, 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. And it maybe amounts to like an hour and a half of wasted time in like a 35-hour game. So it's not like terribly egregious, but it's noticeable and deliberate. There's one section in this game that is a section that I always actively avoided until this playthrough, and that is Beneath the Well, where in Beneath the Well you have to obtain items for these Gibdos, these mummies blocking the door, and it turns out many of these items can be found within the dungeon itself, but the very first door they want a blue potion. And every time I played this game, I just skipped this section. I just thought it was a huge waste of time. It turns out this section is actually really good. It just rubbed me the wrong way. But despite the fact that there's this interesting thing of finding all these disparate items and opening the doors in the proper sequence, there are like 3 items like along the critical path of this dungeon, with some optional items too, or optional doors rather, that you need to leave the well to go get. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not like it's a huge deal. I did have quite a conniption on the first go when they asked for a blue potion. Blue? Something blue. Oh gosh. Oh no. Okay, this is off to a terrible start already. Gosh, kill me. Just kill me. Oh gosh, no. This is worse than I thought. I think I may have to like literally use the pig snout to sniff out a mushroom to then take it to the witch. Oh, I hope that's not it. No. Oh my goodness, what a disaster. What a bunch of Donkey Kong 64 bullshit if that's the case. Oh gosh. Beneath the Well, I always look it up because I just couldn't be bothered. Because I look at it, I'm like, it's of no value. Oh, so I can't even, oh gosh, no. So she's not even in because she's looking for her sister. So I have to do this section again just to, oh gosh, no. You bastards at Nintendo. They're like, oh no, our game only averages 25 hours long. We have to, oh
gosh, make it 30 hours long. This is what valuing length in a game gets you. Nonsense. Nothing. Gets you bullshit. Oh gosh, I'm already freaking out.
Conniption aside, you need like milk, and then you need, I think, magic beans. So you need to go out for those things. Otherwise, everything can be found if you're patient and you look around. But the fact that they make you leave is kind of a huge waste of time. And then there's the spider house by the sea, where if you're lucky and you do that on the first day, you get the reward for it. If you do it on the second and third day, though, the fella who comes by tells you should have done it on the first day, intimating that you should go back and redo it on the first day, which is kind of a waste of time, though. The game already kind of compels you to come back a second time anyway, so one, it's padding that isn't a big deal, but it's also padding that wasn't necessary. And there are other little mistakes too that follow along this kind of pattern, and I'll throw them up here because I don't want to go through each and every one of them. The other big flaw that isn't tied to this, though, and it's not like a big flaw, it's not the worst thing in the world, but the inventory management is a little laden down with all the masks that you receive. When they developed the inventory system for Ocarina, I assume they did it ground up with your set amount of items, and I think it works in that game. But with 24 masks and 3 transformation masks, your 3 item slots just aren't enough. Interestingly, you could probably fix this with putting your main transformation mask on the D-pad, your unused and unloved D-pad on that N64 controller, but they didn't think to do that. And one of the worst examples of the inventory being laden down is the ascent up to the Stone Tower Temple, where you have to make these little effigies of yourself by playing a song, and you need to be switched over to a certain mass to push down the pressure switches, the transformation mass, and it's not the end of the world, but it's about 20 to 30 minutes of pretty terrible stuff. And even after you've gotten to the top, there's still some Elegy of Emptiness portions within the dungeon, was kind of insane. Either way, so those are like kind of the errors within this game. They're not a huge deal ultimately, because a lot of these individual bits of padding are actually nestled within some pretty strong sections. So it, in a weird way, it doesn't end up mattering all that much. But its predecessor, Ocarina of Time, didn't have any noticeable issues like this. None at all. Well, I mean, it wasn't like it was a truly perfect game, but any of the issues are kind of spread out. Whereas in this game, there are some things that you can actively point to. So if you're one of those people who is bigger on Ocarina of Time, you can use this as ammunition. Otherwise, that's probably all I really want to talk about with this game. As I said, it's a very phenomenal game, and these small issues aside, it has so much going for it. And I'm very sad, though, that on this playthrough, I didn't really enjoy all those aspects to the degree that I would want to. And it seems that the magic in this game is finite, which is usually an indicator that a game's novelty is maybe a bit shallow, but I don't think that's the case here. It's just what it is in this case. I've looked at everything here. It's all pretty solid. But for myself, I wasn't enjoying it as much as I had hoped. And, when I think about this game, like, I'm not usually one to think back on my first playthrough. It's not something I really need to do. I enjoy games on multiple playthroughs more often than not. But this game on the first playthrough, just super incredibly magical. And I think when it comes to playing this game optimally, how it relates to my first playthrough is that in my first playthrough, I really didn't engage with everything. I didn't pull every thread. Things kind of just existed on the peripheral, going past me, going over my head, kind of like with Mad Men, with all the quests that I potentially didn't take on. And in a weird way, maybe that made all that stuff very mysterious and very, very mysterious. Kind of like, I couldn't see the man behind the curtain. All I saw was a dynamic world moving around me, and I was part of it, and it was a beautiful thing. And, it still remains a beautiful thing. And story-wise, even on this playthrough, I felt strong about this. This game, at its most profound to me, is in the beginning. And in the beginning, to use musical terminology, it's essentially a prolonged state of dissonance. You are wandering alone in the woods, and then you lose your horse, and then you lose your original form. You become a Deku scrub. And then from there, you're a stranger in a strange land, in a strange form, almost moving around aimlessly, taking on these little tasks that aren't actually all that terribly important. But then, and then you reach this place, the Astral Observatory. And this game, has such a strong soundtrack. But in the Astral Observatory, the song that plays, the neon colors, it's this note of consonance that plays for the first time, and it's so striking to me, and it's so beautiful. And then from there, you catch a glimpse of Skull Kid, so you're actually kind of on his trail again, which ties back to that consonant note. And for the first time, things are looking up. It's such a beautiful prologue for that. And I love the Astral Observatory, and I listen to that song outside of the game fairly often. It's beautiful. And that scene kind of reminds me, it's like a microcosm for my feelings on this game. And because this game, it's one of the few games I would say like makes my life better. And not by much, by like 1 or 2%. It's just a game that, makes me happy, or it made me happy, and maybe it did a little less so, but less so now. Even still, though, still had a great amount of fun with it. But that first playthrough, just it's magic, and I'm kind of sad that it's finite. But the game just makes my life a little better, and it's one of the few games like that does that. Most games really don't. I mean, they're enjoyable, but they're kind of just a product. They're fodder. But I truly think this game is a piece of media that people who don't play games should play. It's really quite something. And beyond just the story and atmosphere, the gameplay's super strong as well, with the dungeons and the transformation maps, which I didn't talk about. They exist, and they're just kind of great on their own, even though they don't technically have to be, like the Zora swimming, and even the Deku scrub, his little twirl on the water, the Goron rolling. It's all good stuff that I don't have time to talk about. So, all that said, I would say this game, appraising it out of 10, this is a 9.5 out of 10. It was actually the only game in my mind that I was considering 10 out of 10 for. And I'm a little bummed out that I can't give it that, just with its flaws. And overall, of all the Zelda games that I've reviewed, and probably the Zelda games I will review going forward, this is the best Zelda game. Interestingly enough, though, it might not be my favorite, though. I think I like Twilight Princess a little better in some ways. It's significantly worse than this game, but Twilight Princess, just a great meat and potatoes Zelda game. And it could be almost up to the quality of this game if it was more tightly wound. Just a little more difficulty to make its rewards more meaningful and its combat more intense, and yada yada yada. But this game, speaking of being tightly wound, this game is fairly tightly wound around its concepts, committed to them, and they're really strong concepts, even if they're not concepts that I necessarily would need to see occur again. So that's Majora's Mask. I think very highly of this game, and so with that appraisal out of the way, we're gonna go ahead and rank it. Okay, where does Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask sit in this ranking? Seeing as I have given it a 9.5 out of 10, we're just gonna throw it right in with the big boys at the top. That is Super Mario 64 and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Is it better than Ocarina of Time? I would say so, pretty easily, very readily. I would say it's better. Its noticeable blemishes do make it compare somewhat disfavorably to Ocarina, as I said before, but it's these blemishes are pretty small potatoes, and then like all the other concepts and all the other aspects, for the most part, outside of a few, are stronger than Ocarina. The 3-day cycle is stronger than Ocarina's adventure format, I would say. The graphics are considerably better, particularly the textures. The gameplay's better, even though they share the same kind of combat, but the gameplay with the Goron and the Deku Scrub and the Zora and all the other added things, I would say it's superior. And the dungeons are superior, even if they're a little less in terms of content as far as minutes go. Music-wise, I mean, it'd be hard to say that Majora's Mask has better music than Ocarina, though I would say that they go pretty toe-to-toe with one another. Majora's Mask has great music. Oath to Order, Song of Healing, Deku Palace. Ikana Valley's pretty good. Ikana Castle, just to name a few. I mean, there's a few more yet. Again, though, Ocarina's soundtrack is bigger, certainly, and some of the sound of Ocarina is used in Majora, but there's still enough original content there, enough original pieces that Majora's Mask can hold its own. Either way, Majora's Mask, I think it's a stronger game overall. And I would say it's also stronger than Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 just doesn't have as many things going for it, though I will say that Super Mario 64's levels are maybe more complex in their design, since every surface, every wall, every hill is essentially interactable with Mario, whereas in Legend of Zelda, whether you're in a dungeon or out and about, a lot of those places are kind of just finite in how you can engage with them. That being said, though, there's more than just gameplay to consider. There's the narrative and the music and the graphics and the atmosphere, and Majora's Mask is better in those key areas. So that puts it at the top of the heap, and it's going to stay there. This is the best Nintendo 64 game. Don't think I can have my mind changed on that. I'm going to forgo rattling through the rankings. We'll save that for the finale, which will take place as soon as I can get it done. But that will do it for this show. If you have something to say about Majora's Mask or any others of these games, or, you know, whatever, you just throw it down in the comments, or send me a long, wordy email. And you can send that to nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. Until next show, take care and have a God bless day. Bye bye.